This is lecture one. This is going to be New Worlds, talking about the First Nations here in the Americas, and then a little bit about First Contact. Um, it seems like a lot of times with U.S. history, we start the history of the Americas at 1492, or we start the history of the United States at 1607 when the English founded their first permanent colony here. Um, and if we're going to cover North American history from the first human arrival to 1865, that is, 60 to 90,000 years of history in 15, 16 weeks. That's really difficult to do. But the problem with starting the history of this part of the world with the arrival of Europeans in some way is that it's taking the first Americans out of American history, and it gives you the impression, the very incorrect impression, that nothing important happened here until Europeans arrived, and that's factually not true, and it also makes it easy to forget that white American history and the survival of those European settlers is owed to native people. When we start talking about the Mayflower, those first pilgrims, they survived their first winter barely by stealing Wampanoag corn, and then in the spring and the summer they were given seed corn by the Wampanoag, and they were taught by their native neighbors how to grow their own, mostly to stop them from stealing. And the reason that the Plymouth Company survived was that initial dependence on native people. England had tried other northern colonies before this, but Plymouth was the only northern colony that survived. And several of the founders of the United States as a government were influenced by the different ways that Indian nations governed. Like John Adams was influenced by the separation of powers found in the way that the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, governed. And Thomas Jefferson frequently visited with Cherokee leaders when he was a young man, and he encouraged other politicians, his sort of political disciples, to do the same thing. So we have to talk about the First Nations of North America. We're going to talk about what we know, what we think we know, and a little bit about how what we think we know academically changes. And one thing we need to get out of the way in a class at an Oklahoma college is probably less necessary for us than colleges in other parts of the country. But it's worth internalizing this knowledge. The First Nations that we're going to talk about, for the most part, are not things of the past. These nations still exist. But the native population was absolutely devastated, with first contact and continuing on for several hundred years. But all you have to do is look around at the county that we're in, at Ottawa County, where 9 different tribes are headquartered, to know that native people are not relics, that this is not just dry history, it's not dead history, right? These are living, breathing civilizations that changed, absolutely, because of contact with Europeans, but are not gone. And we will have to do some generalizations as well, because of the time frame that we have to work with, because you've only got 16 weeks to learn a tremendous amount of information. But generalizing about First Nations can be really difficult and not always accurate. There was so much diversity in North America before Europeans arrived. There were actually more nations here, more distinct languages, more ethnic groups, more civilizations in North America than there were in Europe at the same time. So it can be very problematic to generalize. There are some philosophies, there are some beliefs that will be similar between different cultures, between different nations, especially for those nations that lived close to each other in the same region. There were some aspects of life that tended to hold true for those groups. Now, when we come across some interesting deviations from those generalizations. I'll try to stop and talk a little bit about them because those differences can be so fascinating. But we're going to talk about what we know and what we think we know, and all of that has changed over time, particularly what we know about early North America. For one thing, most of the nations that are now in the United States did not have a writing system. Now, you go down to Mexico, you go to Central America, you go to South America, they did have writing systems. But up around where we are, as far as we know right now, no one had a writing system. So without those written records, it can be difficult to figure out what happened. When someone is trying to study a society that doesn't have those written records, the most important thing that you can do is listen. Pre-literate societies depend on their oral tradition, their elders, their storytellers to pass down their history. Not made up stuff, but real history. So that can survive. And then once they develop a writing system, then that can be written down and passed down in that more secure way. Like the Indian nations of today, the INEO campus is situated between all of these different nations who've all got a strong sense of their own history. Listening to them has not come easily for an awful lot of historians. But once they get over that hump, once they get over that speed bump of trying to say, well, these aren't academic sources, so it doesn't count. Once you actually get past that and start listening, many of those stories turn out to be incredibly accurate. You've also got archaeology. You can use that. That's the study of physical objects, tools and clothes and human remains. And that's how people speak to us from thousands of years ago and how they tell us how they lived and how they died. And if we're lucky, we can find out what was important to them. And usually what we find out is that what was important to them is almost exactly what was important to us, what's still important to us. It's home and family. And people don't really seem to be that different across thousands of years, whether they hunt with a spear or with a credit card. Now, what we think we know about pre-Columbian America, about the first nations of the Americas, has changed a lot, and very recently. Like when I was in high school, they were telling us that North America had only been inhabited by humans for about 12,000 years. And absolutely 100%, those people had come as one group. They had come from Siberia, which is now in Russia. They had come only across the Bering Strait in one group, and those were the ancestors of all the native people, and it happened 13,000 years ago, and that's that. Well, native people have always known better. They've always known that that's not the whole story. But it took a long time for historians to start listening. Once that happened, though, we start coming up with other roots. And of course, the date of first human settlement gets pushed back further and further. So when I was in high school, they were still going with that 13,000 year date. By the time I finished college, they were using 30,000 years. And that's only a 4-year stretch of time for me. But what we had academically valid evidence of had expanded by 17,000 years. Today, we have valid academically recognized evidence of at least 60,000 years of human settlement. And I've only been out of high school for years. A while, but not a whole long time. So what we think we know, and of course native people have been saying ever since first contact, that they have effectively always been here. And that is, once academia started to recognize valid evidence, that came to be seen as more and more accurate, what native people have had to say about themselves. We know today that humans have been in North and South America for at least 60,000 years. There is some evidence to push it back to 90 to 100,000 years. That's still currently being evaluated. Kind of looks like good evidence, though. We know that it wasn't just one group of people. And we know that it happened over and over and over again through different routes. A lot of folks coming through the Bering Strait, that traditional place that academics have said, but we also know there was a lot of sea voyages, between Asia and the west coast of North and South America and Central America. And in fact, we know that Asia and the Americas retained contact, that they stayed in contact with each other. They continued to trade with each other, which, I mean, again, when I was in high school, they said simply didn't happen. They said once the Ice Age ended, there was no more contact between the Americas and the rest of the world. And today we have solid academic peer-reviewed proof that that's not true at all, that there always was this contact. The early travelers, mostly hunters, right? They're looking for game. They're looking for animals that they can hunt. They spread across North and South America. But as the Ice Age ended, they do face a little bit of a crisis. Well, a big crisis. And it's not just the people in the Americas either. They face crises all around the world, in Asia and Europe and Africa, because as the Ice Age ends, the Earth warms up. And then the giant animals that they had hunted, like the mammoths, those big animals start to go extinct because the food that they relied on is dying off now that the Earth is warming up. So the humans who relied on those big game animals are facing a food crisis. What are we going to eat? You know, what we used to eat is now dying. The plants are dying. The animals that relied on those plants are dying. What are we going to do? About 9,000 years ago, at about the same time that agriculture was being developed in central China and in the Near East, in Iraq, agriculture was also developing independently in Mexico. As this new technology, really, as this technology spread north and south, agriculture allowed people not only to survive, but to thrive, to build settled civilizations, to build cities, to become permanent settled people. Now, when we think about native North America, we often don't think about cities. That's not the impression that's usually given through media or through K through 12 education, the idea of cities before Europeans arrived here. But in fact, we did have. In South America and in Central America, there were a number of very large cities, and even here in what is now the United States, there were long-term, permanent, settled cities. Not a lot. Not on the scale of African cities or Asian cities or European cities. One of the reasons why we, north of the Rio Grande, had difficulty building as many large cities was because we didn't have indigenous animals that could be domesticated, large indigenous animals that could be domesticated. South America has llamas and alpacas. The rest of the world has horses and cows and oxen. But up here, we didn't have any of those animals, and that meant we were limited in how much farming we could do, limited in how much surplus food we could build up, and so that limited our ability to build cities. But we did have some, and some of them were honestly very impressive. But for lack of a native cow, native North America was largely a rural society. Now, in the beginning, though, development between the old world, Asia, Africa, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the new world kind of kept pace with each other for a good long while. We developed agriculture at about the same time that the old world did. Native North Americans started building huge monumental complexes before the first Egyptian pyramids were built. If you go down to Louisiana, there's a place called Watson Brake. And the mounds, the monuments there are about 5,400 years old. They're older than the pyramids. Civilizations here rose and fell because of war, because of famine, just like civilizations around the world did. In what is today the Southwest, so Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, West Texas, particularly around the Rio Grande, in the Southwest, the ancestors of today's Hopi and Zuni people began to settle into permanent villages about 3,000 years ago, at about the same time that the great kingdoms of the Near East, like the Assyrians, were starting to prosper. So were our folks in the Southwest. And these Southwestern peoples, get to this map here, in sort of three different groups. They eventually built large, centrally planned towns with multifamily housing, almost like apartment buildings. They conducted trade with people as far away as central Mexico, the Mississippi Valley. In fact, these ancestral Puebloan people in the green here on the map, they had trade contacts down in Guatemala. And we know this because they had macaws. You know, those wonderful, bright, colorful birds. They had macaws that they had imported from Guatemala. Some of their buildings, some of their structures are so huge that even today they're mind-boggling. Like Pueblo Bonito is, you can kind of think of it as an apartment building, sort of, and it's one of 7 very large structures in this place called Chaco Canyon, which is in northern New Mexico. Pueblo Bonito was the largest of the structures there. It's got more than 800 rooms. And one of the really cool things about all of the structures at Chaco Canyon and a lot of the architecture of the Southwest in general is that it wasn't just big. It was also mathematically designed to align with solar elements. So if you go to Chaco Canyon and you go to any of these large structures, any of these pueblos in Chaco Canyon, you see these round things in between, sort of in the central courtyard of the apartment areas. These are called kivas, and they're ceremonial rooms. They're where you would go to take part in different, religious rituals, purification ceremonies, things like that. And all of them are built to align with the movements of the sun. Some of them catch the sun's rise and fall at the solstice, on the longest day or the shortest day of the year. Some of them are aligned to the equinox, the fall or the spring equinox, but all of them are aligned in some way with the sun. And one of the things that this tells us is not just that the sun was important for the people of the Southwest, for these ancestral Puebloan peoples, but that they had higher mathematics. That you have to have that. You have to understand that in order to be able to build these massive structures with still 1,000 years later, these extremely precise astrological, astronomical alignments. Now, a lot of the folks who lived in the Southwest, men were responsible for farming. Along the Rio Grande in particular, they perfected the techniques of desert farming, learning how to grow crops, especially cotton, in a part of the world that doesn't get a whole lot of rainfall, that's pretty dry. So some of them had irrigation systems. These Hohokam people in the Arizona area, they actually had hundreds of miles of canals that they dug to act as irrigation systems, to water cotton and beans and corn. They also, all across this southwestern area, they also bred corn specifically to be drought resistant. And when you get into the driest areas of the Southwest, they practice this technique that's known today as dry farming, which is actually becoming kind of a fad again in agriculture, because it's very cost-effective and environmentally responsible. What dry farming is that you find a riverbed, a dry riverbed, and you plant your stuff there. And then in the spring and the summer, when the snow melts off the mountains, it'll come and flood that dry riverbed, and your crop gets watered without you having to find some, permanent source of water and constantly being watering this crop. So it's really effective in terms of labor cost, and it's effective in terms of using the environment to your advantage. You'd use this runoff from the mountains. It was very effective. Typically, the men were responsible for farming. Women would gather wild fruits, and especially among the ancestral Puebloan people, the ancestors of the Hopi and the Zuni, Pecos Pueblo, women did most of the building. The homes were constructed by women. Something that totally freaked the Spanish out when they arrived. Let's go back to this picture. This is Canyon de Chelly. This is in the American Southwest. And it's a really interesting way of building. It's a way of using the environment to your advantage. And it shows, a great deal of planning that went into this settlement here. Canyon de Chelly was occupied by a settled population for several hundred years. So when you think of Native people, and you have that stereotype of everyone being nomadic and riding across the plains, and a majority of Native people were actually at least semi-permanently settled. And that was certainly the case in the Southwest, very settled population. But this is really cool because it's built in these two different ways. You've got this lower town that's very easy to access, but then you've got this upper town that is clearly very difficult to access. The upper town is also shaded by the actual side of a mountain here. So what you would do in the summer is you would retreat to this upper town so that you would be shaded during the heat of the day. In the wintertime, you might go down to the lower town. You would also retreat to the upper town if you were under attack because it is so hard to access. You'll notice, you can look at the walls of that upper town there. There are no outside doors. There are outside windows, but no outside doors. So that means if somebody does attack you, you go to that upper town, and it's very difficult for them, first of all, to get near the buildings, and then second, to actually get inside. They would need to climb up to the roof. All the doors were on the roof. So they need to climb up to the roof and then get down to attack you that way, which was extremely difficult to do. So this is an environmentally sound and a militarily sound, defensive way to build here in the Southwest. The governments of the people of the Southwest had a lot of variation. This is something that you're going to want to remember for the test, that there is a lot of variation in the way that the Southwestern nations governed. In general, I'm going to do those generalizations. In general, larger towns tended to have a more formal style of government. They tended to have a Pueblo council, a town council, with different members chosen, almost always men, chosen by the adults of that town to do something. Often they would have someone who's responsible for water management, who would make sure that the irrigation works are in good repair, who would allocate water to each family. You would have someone who is responsible for defense. You would have someone who is responsible for when and where the planting is going to happen. And in very large settlements, you might even have one person kind of directing all of those other people in the town council. It's a very recognizable system to us today, right? A town council, different people responsible for different things, and maybe someone over them, just making sure that they're all directed and they're all doing what they're supposed to do. There is this assumption, there is this stereotype that Native people had no formal government. That is absolutely untrue. And one of the easiest ways to see an example of formal government is by looking at these southwestern pueblos. Now, when you get into smaller settlements, the government is a little more loosely organized. Often you would have each village governing itself, kind of by consent of all of the adult men of that village. You can't really govern by consent of all adults when you get the large settlements, right? If you've only got a town of 200 people, then sure, let all the guys get together, shout it out, and make a decision. When you've got 10,000 people, that doesn't work so well. That's not very efficient. Now you get out to the mountains. Once the Apache people arrive, when you go to the different Apache groups in the mountains, there was often no central government, and decisions were made by consent of all the adults of that settlement, not just the men. but all of the adult women too. The Apache, particularly the Western Apache, were a little different from some of their neighbors. I told you we were going to talk about some of those differences. The Western Apache were matrilineal and matrilocal. Matrilineal means that your descent, your bloodline, is traced through your mother. And matrilocal means that when a young woman married, she would stay with her mother's family, and her husband would come to live with her. In a patrilocal civilization, as much of Europe was, when a young woman married, she would go to live with her husband's family. But in the Western Apache, he would come to live with her family in her clan, and the children would be of her clan. And we're going to move east and do some generalizations about the folks in the eastern woodlands. The eastern woodlands is defined as essentially everything east of the Mississippi River. It's a massive amount of land with a lot of variations within it. Now, one of the earliest known civilizations in the eastern woodlands, what is today considered the eastern woodlands, was this Hopewell civilization. The Hopewell people were centered around the Ohio River Valley. So if you go to Ohio and northern Kentucky, you can see a lot of the monuments that they left behind. Some of them extraordinary in scale and in complexity. The Hopewell people were known for building ceremonial mounds and burial mounds. Serpent Mound in Ohio, in southern Ohio, is one of their ceremonial mounds. You'll notice that it is in the shape of a snake. It's so large, though, that you can't stand anywhere on the ground and know that it's the shape of a snake. You can only actually see the serpent form when you're flying overhead. So again, this tells us that the Hopewell people 2,000 years ago understood higher mathematics. They understood geometry. They understood astronomy in order to make the calculations necessary to build these effigy mounds, like this one in the shape of a snake. They have now I can't remember the name of the town. There is a town in Ohio that has this massive ceremonial earthworks that is so large that one of the smallest parts of this earthwork today forms the boundary around a full-size 18-hole golf course. The entire complex is absolutely massive. We don't know how large it was originally because settlers came in and they plowed under parts of the building and they took stuff down, and what's left today is still absolutely massive. And that structure, that ceremonial structure, Newark, Ohio is where it is. It's the Newark earthworks. That ceremonial structure is built to align with the phases of the moon. So you go to the southwest, you go to the ancestral Pueblo people, everything there is aligned with the sun. But you go to the Ohio Valley and there are these massive earthworks aligned to the moon. And a lot of historians didn't understand what was going on there. They measured, they tried to prove that it was aligned with the sun, and none of those sun lines matched up. So they weren't really sure what the Newark earthworks were for until they started talking to the descendants of these Hopewell people, when they started listening. You talk to today's Shawnee people, and they understand very clearly that this is probably aligned to the moon, because even today, traditional Shawnee use a lunar calendar. They plant, they dehorn calves by the moon. That's very important for their religion. And once academics understood that they should be looking for lunar calculations, and they discovered that this Newark earthworks massive monumental complex had been built to align with the phases of the moon over an entire lunar cycle. If you take astronomy here at NEO, you will learn that a lunar cycle is not a year long. It's almost 19 years long. So these people studied these calculations, they kept these records, they did the math for almost 2 decades before they ever started building the earthworks so that they could get it right. After the Hopewell declined, other cultures flourished in the Mississippi River Valley. These cultures do have elements of Hopewell culture because they're also building these massive monumental earthworks. But this new culture was centered on the city of Cahokia. Cahokia is right outside of East St. Louis, so it's not very far from here. It's near the modern-day city of St. Louis. By the year 1000, Cahokia had a population of between 15 and 20,000 people. The city of Cahokia was bigger than the city of London was at the same time. And Cahokia was at the center of this massive trading network. They were on the Mississippi River, right there where St. Louis is today. They had a trade network that stretched east all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, that stretched down to the Gulf of Mexico, and in some good years even into central Mexico, stretched north well into Canada as well. There was an industry at Cahokia as well. There was a mining industry. They mined for salt. They traded for other mined goods. They made copper instruments and copper decorations. And they also had a small industry that manufactured stone farming tools. Now, there were other groups that are familiar to us today who were related to or connected to this Cahokian civilization. They came to be known as the Mississippian peoples. Mississippian peoples would include folks like the Creek and the Seminole and the Natchez. And the Natchez are, they're one of those deviations from the norm. The Natchez had an extremely complex religious hierarchy, one of the most highly developed theocracies of the pre-Columbian era. A theocracy means that the religious establishment is completely enmeshed with the civil government. And so the high priest was the head of state. They also had, the Natchez, also had a noble class. They had a very stratified class system, which was unusual for this particular area and the time period when the Natchez thrived. Now, further east, we get closer to the Atlantic Ocean. We've got, hundreds of tribes who are essentially permanently settled people. They live in towns and villages scattered from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. Most of them are farming people. They do some hunting. They hunt turkey and deer and other wild game, but there is a tremendous emphasis on farming, particularly in the eastern part of the eastern woodlands. So we're talking, folks from the Narragansett up in New England, through the Iroquois in New York, down through the Cherokee in the Carolinas and Georgia. A lot of them focused on what's known as Three Sisters planting, and women were usually responsible for the farming here. A Three Sisters planting is, we talked about how, labor smart and environmentally smart the farming of the Southwest was for that environment. Three Sisters style agriculture was just as, effective and efficient in the eastern woodlands. So what you would do, you would use these three crops together. You would plant corn, and the corn would grow up tall. But one of the problems with corn is that it leaches nitrogen out of the soil. So you can only plant for a few years before the soil is exhausted, then you have to go somewhere else. If you don't want to be a semi-nomadic person, if you want to stay where you live, then you need to plant something that will keep the nitrogen in the soil. And that's beans. So you plant the corn, it grows up tall, but it takes out nitrogen. You plant beans around the corn. Then the beans can use the corn stalks. They can grow up the corn stalks and you don't have to stake them. So that's a good, smart way of saving labor. And then the beans fix nitrogen in the soil. So what the corn takes out, the beans put back in, and you can stay there and continue to plant longer. Then you use the squash. And the big leaves of the squash will help shade, especially in the south, will help shade the roots of those other two plants from the heat of the sun. So it allows them to live and to grow and to thrive. These three crops work so well together that villages were able to become permanent, long-term settled villages. Now in the east, in the far east, where we're talking about now, they also have fairly extensive trade routes, crisscross the eastern part of the continent. We also see a lot of different groups fighting over who has the right to trade or to hunt in certain areas. In the 15th century, early 1400s, late 1300s, various leagues and alliances and confederations started to form. And that created a centralized form of government, or at least something approaching a centralized form of government, for various tribes in the east. In the southeast, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw, and the Creek each united dozens of towns into loose alliances. And each of those nations brought something distinct to the table. Like the Choctaw had a remarkably strong trade system. So if you could get an alliance with the Choctaw, then you could piggyback off their trade system. The Creeks contributed diplomats and ambassadors to other confederacies, so you could use that network that they had built if you could get an alliance with them. If you head up north to the New York region, the Pennsylvania region, 5 Iroquoian peoples, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Seneca and Cayuga, banded together to form the Haudenosaunee, the Great League of Peace, what today we would call the Iroquois Confederacy. And by forming that confederacy, these nations helped to stabilize what had become a dangerous and chaotic military situation in the Northeast. The way the Haudenosaunee worked, the way these Iroquoian groups functioned was every town would have a men's fire and a women's fire, where all of the men and all of the women could each gather to talk about the questions that are facing that village, what they need to do, and then the women, the elder women, would choose men that they would send to a tribal council. So you're Mohawk, you live in a Mohawk village, the grandmas of the village will choose which men are going to go to the Mohawk Tribal Council that every Mohawk town will send representatives to. And then the Mohawk will choose, the elder women of the Mohawk tribe will choose men to send to a confederation council, which they have once a year. They called it the Great Council Fire. And representatives from each of these 5 tribes, the Seneca and Cayuga and Oneida and Mohawk and Onondaga, would meet once a year to discuss issues facing each of their tribes and to kind of coordinate what they're going to do about the challenges that are facing them, what their policies are going to be toward less powerful tribes. And one of the things that made the Iroquois Confederacy really interesting, I think, is that even though the people making the decisions, let me rephrase that, even though the people who are taking part in the Great Council Fire are all men, they are chosen by the elder women of their villages and tribes. Women in the Iroquois Confederacy also had the power to review the decisions made by the counselors and veto laws that they disagreed with. Send the men back to the council fire and say, no, you did it wrong here. We're going to need you to come up with something else. The most striking feature of Native society before Europeans arrived was just its sheer diversity. I mean, just looking at the very small number of tribes that we've talked about. You know, there were thousands before Europeans arrived, and we've just talked about maybe a dozen. But even within that dozen, there's so much diversity. You know, each group had its own political system and religious beliefs. North America was home to literally hundreds of languages. And Native people, indigenous people, didn't think of themselves as a single group. There was no need for them to do that. That was an idea invented by Europeans who either didn't notice or didn't care about the differences between these indigenous groups. Most Native identities centered on their village, their clan, their tribe, their confederacy. And so when Europeans did arrive, many Native groups, rather than banding together to force the Europeans out, they don't see the Europeans as a threat. Instead, they see Europeans, and especially European weapons, as a chance to use against what they see as a bigger threat, their traditional native enemies. So instead of uniting against the Europeans, who they're not really worried about, they use these newcomers to strengthen themselves and give their nation more power. Now, even though there is so many differences between these different tribes and different confederations, many native societies, not all, many did share certain common beliefs and common characteristics. And it was often those things they had in common that became part of the reason why Europeans felt so justified in taking over and judging native people as inferior or as heathen. One of the differences between native people in general and the European newcomers was that most native groups had very little separation between religious life and private life. In Europe, you go to church on Sundays. Everyone in Europe everyone in Western Europe was legally Catholic at this time. So you go to church on Sunday, you go to confession, you do that stuff. But in the native world, there wasn't this idea that religion was something you did a couple days a week. Religious ceremonies were directly related to everyday life, to farming, to hunting, to birth and marriage and coming of age ceremonies and your identity within the group. Most tribes, not all, but most, tended toward this belief system known as animism. Animism is the belief that the whole living world and everything in it has a spirit and a power. And so native religious ceremonies often aim to harness that spirit and that power to serve the interests of their people. In a sense, it's a kind of prayer, although Europeans didn't see it that way at all. The Indian religion doesn't have a sharp distinction between natural and supernatural, or between secular and religious activities. But in some respects, native beliefs weren't super different from European beliefs. Many native people believe that there is a powerful spirit in natural things, but that there is a single creator. That's something that would have made sense to Europeans if they had stopped and listened. And of course, just because the Catholic Church held sway in Europe and strongly discouraged the practice of ancient beliefs, that didn't stop many Europeans from still practicing old folk traditions, like carving jack-o'-lanterns, which folks still do, right? We still carve jack-o'-lanterns around Halloween. That was originally a folk belief in Ireland, actually. You carve gourds, you carve turnips and root vegetables to look scary so that they'll scare the evil spirits away. That's what the church saw as superstition and tried to stamp out. So there are still some similarities. Practicing older beliefs, some Europeans would still go to holy wells and holy springs and pray there, trying to harness that natural power. That wasn't unusual. But nearly all Europeans who arrived here almost immediately decided that native people were in dire need of being converted to what they saw as true religion. In some cases, that really was out of a genuine desire to spread salvation as they understood it. In others, it was an excuse to exploit native people and their land. And the native attitude toward land was another thing that Europeans didn't really understand. and didn't know that they didn't understand, which made things just so much worse. So another generalization, in most Native communities in what is now the United States, the idea of private property was not at all like the European idea. And in general, the less settled a tribe was, the less their idea of land ownership and management was like the European idea. So you head into the plains and you've got nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. They have a large area where they hunt, and then they've got a little more compact area where they would have winter villages and they would maybe farm a little bit there. And that was land that can only be farmed and lived on by members of that nation. Then the larger area where they hunt can, be kind of shared with allied nations. But nobody actually owns that land. And that concept would have seemed very strange to them. Now, you head to the East Coast. You head to people that, say, the English met fairly early on. And in those settled, permanent towns and villages, often all of the land would be held by all the people in common. It's only livable, it's only farmable by members of that group. But it was for all members of that group. Whereas in Europe, one person owns a piece of land, and that one person has a deed with his name on it. And then when he dies, it passes to his designated heirs, and they get that piece of paper that say, only this person owns this land. That's a completely different process. When Europeans arrive, nobody here has proof that the land is theirs. Nobody has proof that Europeans will recognize as proof. We don't have a piece of paper. This is where we farm because this is where we farm. We've been farming here for hundreds of years. And when Europeans come and think that they are buying land or trading for land, there's often a mental disconnect between what Europeans thought they were doing and what Native people thought they were doing. Europeans thought that they were buying land and it would become theirs forever and only theirs. But oftentimes Native people thought that they were accepting this gift of whatever, and in exchange they would give these Europeans the ability to use the land to hunt or to plant alongside their own people. Not that they were taken to creative guns and then their people could never go back to that land. That didn't make any sense to them. And with a few exceptions, like the Natchez, Native societies typically were not very stratified. There wasn't traditionally much emphasis on stuff, on accumulating wealth and possessions. For one thing, if you're semi-nomadic and you have to move every few years, then it doesn't make sense to build up a lot of stuff. It just makes it harder for you to move. So there's not that emphasis on building up possessions. And in most Native nations, not all, but most, leaders were chosen by the people in some way. So you've got, in the Iroquois Confederacy, you've got elder women choosing the men who will be leaders. In other tribes, it would be like a hereditary element to it. If your father was a chief, you would be raised to become a chief. You would be raised, to learn how to act in these different situations. You would get that education. But if the people of your village don't trust you to actually execute that position well, you're not going to end up as chief. They will choose somebody else. In general, wealth and inherited status meant so much to Europeans, but it meant very little to Native people. And the status of women really freaked out the Europeans too. The first women that Europeans met, that Columbus and his merry band of rapists met, were the ones who lived in the Caribbean, right there. They're the women who lived in Hispaniola, who lived in the Bahamas. They lived where it's warm. And one of the first things that the Spaniards noticed was that they didn't wear as many layers of clothes as European women did. European women, you've seen the pictures. They had the gigantic skirts and the petticoats under it, and they had the ruffs around the neck, and the only bits of skin you could see was the face, because they even wore gloves. But Taino women, down in the Caribbean, they didn't wear shirts. Like, they wore loincloths, like men did. And they could have sex outside of marriage without being punished. They could divorce their husbands, and then they got to keep the house. They owned what they made. They owned their own products. They owned their own tools. For Europeans, that was absolutely, y'all, that was like Girls Gone Wild, 1492. They could not understand why these women were allowed to do pretty much anything that men could do. And when they come in contact with other tribes, there are some that have a few more restrictions on women, but there's just no tribe in native North America that has the level of restriction that European countries put on their women. It was like anarchy, looking at the women here. A lot of tribes are matrilineal. We talked about the Apache. The Cherokee are also matrilineal. The Iroquois nations, they're matrilineal. That gives precedence to mothers in a way that was not given to mothers in Europe. In England, in particular, when the English arrive, they have a law that's known as coverture, rather a legal philosophy, I guess, that's known as coverture. And what coverture means is that when a woman marries, her separate, independent legal identity disappears, and it becomes covered by that of her husband. She no longer exists as an independent person before the law. She is a subordinate unit to her husband. So under English law, a married man controlled his family's property entirely. Even if his wife brought property into the marriage, it would not be hers, it would be his. Whereas in most of the eastern, the Atlantic coast Indian nations, women owned the homes, they owned the tools, they owned the profits of what they made and what they sold. In nations that did a lot of hunting, the women would run the village economy and the government, and they do all the farming. That makes absolutely no sense to Europeans. And all of these differences taken together, differences in religion, differences in land use, land ownership, differences in hierarchy, and differences in gender roles, all of those together were used as a justification by Europeans for saying that these people are barbarians. These people have no idea how to run a proper society. At the very least, they need Europeans to come in and show them how to behave. And if they won't do as they're told, well, then Europeans can take whatever steps are necessary at that point. So that's a little of what Europeans thought of Native people when they first met. But how did that meeting happen? I mean, we all know Columbus, Ocean Blue, 1492. Some of you may be familiar with Viking explorations up in eastern Canada in the late 900s. But what really started the exploratory push, the Vikings didn't stay very long and they didn't have much of an impact. What really started the push for European exploration around the world, what started this exploration that will end up sending Columbus to the Caribbean, was a European desire for Asian and African trade goods and gold. Western Europe, France, Britain, the Italian city-states, the German states, they had been trading with the East, with India and China, along what was called the Silk Road. And the Silk Road, this is a very simplified map. The Silk Road wasn't just one path, it was multiple routes. The Silk Road had been used by European traders to get to Asia for hundreds of years. And for many years, the Silk Road was controlled and protected by the Mongol Empire. We don't usually think of the Mongols as great businessmen, but they really were. Uh, when the Mongols ruled Central Asia and ruled part of China as well, the Silk Road was an extremely efficient way for Europeans to get silk and spices and different kinds of fancy woods and just all that stuff that you can get in Asia. But when the Mongol Empire collapsed, when they were no longer there to defend the traders and these trade routes, then the Silk Road is taken over by bandits and petty warlords, and all of a sudden that's bad for business. European traders no longer feel comfortable, sending their men out on this year-long journey into we don't even know what's going to happen to them, just to try and get a little bit of silk. But the wealthy people of Europe, the kings and the nobles, they still want this stuff. They still want the silk, and they still want all of those spices. They've got to find another way to get it. European traders tried going through the Mediterranean Ocean there by Italy and by Greece, but then they had to deal with the Ottoman Empire, who are not always very friendly toward Europe because of those crusade things where there was a lot of death and invasion, and it just didn't make them very friendly. So we've got to find another way. Europe has to find another way to get that stuff. Can't use the Silk Road. The Ottomans don't like it when you shoot at them, so you can't always use the Ottomans. And while Europe is trying to figure out how to get to Asia, all of a sudden, they started paying attention to sub-Saharan Africa as well. Now, Europe had always traded with North Africa, which was also ruled by the Ottoman Empire. But south of that, south of the desert, it was almost impossible for Europeans to get to. You had to go across the desert. Europeans don't know how to do that very well. You actually couldn't go by sea very effectively if you were a European because of the way that the winds blow. You see on this map, right about here, it's in Senegal today. You get to this point on the West African coast, and the winds blow very fiercely to the south, year-round. They blow exclusively toward the south. So you could get from England down to this part of the world, down to sub-Saharan Africa, but then it would be hell trying to get back. You can't go by boat, not in the kind of boats that Europeans had at the time. They didn't have the technology to tack against the wind. So Europe kind of ignored the vast majority of Africa. They'll trade with the city-states up on the northern part of Africa here. They'll get spices, they'll get ivory from there. They don't really care what's going on down here until all of a sudden they had to sit up and take notice. In 1324, suddenly everybody in Europe started talking about this empire that they'd never even heard of before, called Mali. The nation of Mali is in West Africa today. It's a fairly large country. The empire of Mali was massive. Mansa Musa was the emperor of Mali, and he made his empire famous by making his Hajj to Mecca, his pilgrimage. Mali was and still is majority Muslim. So Mansa Musa makes his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, as he is supposed to do as a good Muslim. And on that journey, he gave away so much gold. He gave gold to mosques. He gave gold to schools. He gave gold to orphanages, to beggars, to widows, to dancing girls. That the value of gold in Europe, where he didn't even go, dropped by half for a decade. So of course, Europe is looking around at like, where did all this gold come from? Our markets are being flooded with gold. It doesn't have the value that it used to have. Oh my God, it all came from that guy? Where did he get it? And more importantly, where can I get it? And Europe, the nations of Western Europe spent more than a century trying to find a way to get to Mali and get back with some of that gold. The first European power that managed to do that was Portugal. Portugal had a young prince that was very interested in sea travel and trade, very focused on making Portugal a great nation. So Prince Henry of Portugal, Henry the Navigator, invited the best and brightest minds in naval technology to come to Portugal and create a new kind of navy that his country could use. He brought people from 1,000 miles away, from the Netherlands, people who built boats that could sail through the frigid North Sea. He brought in Turkish navigators from the Ottoman Empire. Some of them taught Portuguese sailors how to use Arab navigational tools like the astrolabe. Some of them developed new methods of map making. And they also built a new kind of ship, the caravel. The caravel was light years beyond any other ship that Europeans had access to at this time. It's very sturdy. It can stand up to very strong, fierce winds. But most importantly, it can tack against the wind, which is something that no other European ship of the time could do. So that means that you can take a caravel, sail south along the African coast to Mali, and then sail back north. In 1434, a Portuguese ship brought a sprig of rosemary from Mali back to Portugal as proof that they were able to sail past the desert and return. And little by little, Portuguese ships started moving down the coast. In 1485, they reached the nation of Benin, a very imposing city on the southern coast of West Africa, whose craftsmen produced remarkable bronze sculptures that today we can't even replicate the technique that they used. The Portuguese established trading posts along the coast, and then other European nations followed behind them. Portugal also started to colonize the islands off the coast of Africa. They built sugar plantations, and they bought thousands of African slaves to work those plantations. When the New World opened up, the Portuguese will move their sugar plantations and their slaves to the Americas. Slavery existed before the transcontinental slave trade. It existed in Africa before Europeans really started encroaching. But traditionally, African slaves were criminals, or they were debtors, or they were war captives. They had well-defined rights. In some African nations, they could own property. In some, they were able to marry free people. Most African slaves were able to purchase their freedom, or marry out of slavery, or simply be set free. If they were criminals, once their time was up, then they would go free. In Africa, slavery was just one of many forms of labor. It was not the basis of the economy, the way that it became here. Now, when the Portuguese and then other Europeans arrived in Africa, it ballooned the slave trade within that continent. At least 100,000 African slaves were taken to Spain and Portugal between 1450 and 1500, just those two countries. And in 1502, the first African slaves were transported to islands in the Caribbean. There were some African nations, like Benin, that tried to stay out of this European slave trade. They were comfortable with the traditional form of slavery, where slaves have rights and can go free. What it's turning into, though, is so far beyond what they thought of as the natural order of things that they simply refused to be involved. But other African nations did participate, and they became very adept at playing Europeans against each other, collecting taxes on the slave trade from foreign merchants, keeping the trade firmly under their control. For one thing, Europeans really didn't go that far inland. They mostly stayed on the coast, so they needed traders to bring slaves to them. And that ties into, we're going to go off on a tangent here. That ties into a basic mistake that modern day history students commonly make when we look at the relationship between Europe and Africa at this early modern time period. We have this assumption that Europeans in the 14 and 1500s already had technological advantages over Africa, but they didn't. The Portuguese and other Europeans generally operated in Africa only with the permission of African leaders. If Europeans traded, it was because they paid taxes to the local rulers. if Europeans defeated Africans in battle, it was because they had allied with other Africans. And that same point holds for the Americas in the 1500s as well. When we look at Cortez's conquest of Mexico, his technology, his metal weapons were good, but he didn't win because of them. He won because he allied with the native population against the Aztec Empire. And because Westerners tend to assume that Europeans have always had a technological advantage over everyone else, it's hard for them to understand why Europe didn't overrun Africa until the mid to late 1800s. So we say, oh, they couldn't handle the malaria and the heat and the blah blah. Yeah, Europeans did die at a pretty high rate from African diseases, but in fact, many Portuguese and other Europeans from the 14 to the 1700s lived for years along the African coast, west and east. They married locally, they established families, they had businesses and livelihoods there. Europeans took until the late 19th century to conquer Africa, not because that was the first time they had the medicine to fight malaria, but because it took them that long to really develop the weapons that would allow them to do that. The early guns that Europeans had and Africans didn't were honestly not that good. Guns would give you a limited kind of advantage if you were firing from a fortified position like a fort, but if you're firing out in the open, not so much. A musket had incredibly poor aim, and it took so long to reload that in the open field, your enemy could easily rush you in the meantime. We just need to look at warfare between different Europeans in the 15 and 16 and early 1700s to see that pikes and swords were still the most important weapons for soldiers. And bayonets stayed important even through the American Civil War. So back on track. For Africans as well as Europeans, what will become the transatlantic slave trade was a profit-making endeavor. At both ends, the slave trade is supported by governments. African rulers, not in every African nation, but in most of the big ones in West Africa, African rulers allowed kidnappers to collect slaves and then tax them, collected taxes on the captives passing through their territory. European rulers chartered and taxed the slave companies. Slavery had existed all over the world for as long as we have written history. It had existed in Africa long before this Atlantic slave trade began. But again, traditionally it was very different. Mostly slaves in Africa had a set term until the crime was paid off or the debt was paid off or the war was over. African slavery was not race-based. Modern day slave owners didn't say, oh, those Wolof, they're only fit to be slaves. That didn't make sense to them. Slavery was usually not lifelong. Slaves could buy their freedom or work their term of service and then be done with it. Slavery was not hereditary. The children of slave mothers were not automatically slaves themselves. But when the Atlantic slave trade changed the scale of slavery, when that trade transformed it into the export of masses of people, these changes began. Slave trading grew into big business after European traders organized this huge transatlantic market. African involvement, the involvement of some African nations in the transatlantic slave trade is painful for a lot of African Americans, and it's confusing for many European Americans. Americans in general tend to think of Africa as one country and one people, instead of what it really is, a huge continent with almost 60 countries and literally thousands of ethnic groups. According to the stereotypical way of thinking that Africa is a country and a people, Africans were raiding and capturing their own people, which is an unconscionable act. That never actually happened, though. Africans didn't sell their own people. Africans organized and controlled the delivery of captives to Europeans, but the captors and the captives came from different ethnic groups. Often the captors were from large, well-organized kingdoms and empires, and the captives were usually people without strong, well-armed rulers. Between the start of European encroachment on the Americas in 1492 and the end of the Atlantic slave trade in the 1860s, Europeans brought a minimum of 10 million Africans to the Americas, averaged about 170 slave ships a year. At its height, 80,000 people a year were kidnapped. The vast majority of them did not come to what is now the United States. 95% of captives were sent to Brazil and to the Caribbean, the sugar-growing regions. They were worked to an early death. Because the conditions were so bad, they usually didn't have enough children to reproduce themselves. The lack of women, truly appalling infant mortality rate. So their numbers had to constantly be replenished by new captives, and a slave ship coming from Africa would usually stop at the sugar plantation regions first, before then taking the remainder to what is now the U.S. Now, Christopher Columbus was, we think, a pretty seasoned sailor and navigator. We think he was from Genoa in northern Italy. And some of you are going, what do you mean we think? We know that, right? We don't actually know a whole lot about Columbus. He wrote quite a bit about himself, but he often contradicted what he said, so we're not entirely certain what's true and what isn't. We're fairly certain that he had sailed around the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic for a while, that he had, had some education studying ocean currents and wind patterns. Now, when I was in school, they were still telling us this old story that Columbus was the only man on Earth who knew that the Earth was round. And they told us, all of the other reindeer used to laugh and call him names and say, no, the Earth is flat. If you try and sail west from Europe, you're going to fall off the edge of the Earth. I hope they're not still telling that story in schools, because it's not true. I mean, it makes for a great story, right? That Columbus alone knew the truth and everybody around him was stuck in the Dark Ages. But that's not how it really happened. Columbus spent years searching for someone to give him the money to start a journey to the west. Columbus believed that if he sailed west from Europe, he would be able to sail to either China or India. He wasn't sure which he would hit first, and he would be able to do it within about 30 days. He had a very difficult time getting anyone to give him the money for that journey because his math was wrong. I fully sympathize with that myself. He miscalculated how big the Earth is. He believed that Asia was much closer to Europe than it actually was. Now, nobody in Europe knew that there were these two giant continents blocking the way, but they knew for sure that it's going to take more than a month to get to China. All of the other navigators in Europe knew that Columbus's math was wrong. So Columbus went around Europe. He sent his brother around Europe trying to find a ruler or a wealthy patron who would give him the money to try this western journey, to try and find this water route to Asia. Sail west, hit Asia, then you can get all that stuff, right? You get the trade goods, you get the gold, you get the silk, and you don't have to worry about going through the Ottoman Empire, and you don't have to worry about the Silk Road, but we still have all these trade goods. But he had a hard time getting anyone to give him that money because his calculations are off. He actually went to Henry VII of England, and that's kind of a fun rabbit hole to go down, right? Like, how would the history of the world be different if England had been the country to fund his journey? If England had been the first country to start colonizing the Americas? But Henry VII was notoriously cheap. And also he had these advisors telling him that Columbus had his math wrong. So eventually, Columbus got the money, a little bit of money, from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in Spain. They agreed to become the sponsors of this journey. Ferdinand and Isabella were in a unique situation that the rest of Europe was not. Ferdinand and Isabella had united the warring kingdoms of Spain. Spain used to not be one united country, it used to be these different kingdoms. And Ferdinand and Isabella, when they married, had united the two largest kingdoms, and then they joined their military forces together, and they drove the Moors out of Spain. North African Muslims, or the Moors, they had controlled the different kingdoms of Spain for centuries, and so when Ferdinand and Isabella, their armies, drove the Moors out, they called it the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from these foreign overlords. And when the Moors were forced out, then Spain became a fully unified country. Then Ferdinand and Isabella decided to unify their religion as well by forcing all the Jews and Muslims to leave Spain or convert or die. Now that they have done that, Ferdinand and Isabella feel like they're riding pretty high, right? They unified their country, they drove out these foreign enemies, they unified their religion, so now it's time to act like rulers, and it's time to look like rulers, and it's time to have all the silk, and all the spices, and all the ivory, and all the stuff that you want. But since they have literally just fought a war with allies of the Ottomans, and since they have literally just forced all the Muslims out of Spain, they're not going to get the Ottomans to deal with them. They're not going to get any North African traders to deal with them. So they're cut off from the stuff that they want. So it's because of that. It's because of these ambitions that they have to set themselves up as these, the great power of Europe, combined with their inability to achieve that through traditional means. That's what leads them to give a little bit of money to Columbus. Really, they don't give him much. They give him enough for one sort of second-generation caravel and 2 ships that are almost a century old and fewer than 100 men. They gave him royal letters of introduction to give to the rulers of whatever Asian nation he found, and they authorized him to negotiate trade agreements on their behalf, and then they sent him out into the ocean and fully expected that he would die there, because they know his math is wrong too. They're just making this gamble. They've not spent a lot of money on him. If he goes out in the middle of the ocean and dies because his math is wrong, they won't have lost a lot. But if he does find India or China, oh my God, right? They will become the first European country to have that direct line to all of those trade goods in Asia. They will be the only country in Europe that has that. So even though they don't think it's going to work, it's still a gamble that's worth making for them. Now, in October of 1492, after just 33 days of sailing, Columbus and his expedition saw land. And hey, Columbus predicted that they would hit Asia in like a month, so score, right? He landed on this place. It's called San Salvador. He's the one who named it San Salvador. And Columbus was like, yay, India. Oh, wait, this is just an island. That's okay, it's an island off the coast of India, surely, so we're going to get back in the boat, and we're going to try and find the Indian mainland. So he went island hopping. He found Cuba. He found Hispaniola. He never found what he thought was the actual Indian mainland, but he packed a couple dozen Hispaniola natives onto the boat, took them back to Spain to prove that he had found something near India. And look, these are Indians. Of course, once he arrived in Spain, sailors and merchants who had actually been to India recognized immediately that what Columbus thought he found was not at all what he had actually found. But the next year, 1493, Ferdinand and Isabella give Columbus 17 ships and more than 1,000 men and send him back to the Caribbean. Tried to establish a Spanish colony on Hispaniola. It'll take until the early 1500s to really get going. Then Spain starts sending other men. They send Amerigo Vespucci, the first European to see the coastline of South America. And so Vespucci pretty conclusively proved to Europe that this was not India, this is an entirely new continent, which Columbus resented him for the rest of his life. Columbus went to his grave insisting that he had found India. Now, nobody knows exactly how many people lived in North and South America at the time of Columbus's voyages. Estimates are between 75 and 80 million people, which is about the same population as Europe had at the time. Most native people in the Americas lived in Central and South America. The estimates of people who lived in what is now the United States is about 10 million. Whatever the number was, and wherever the people were, the indigenous population suffered a catastrophic and immediate decline because of contact with Europeans and their wars and and enslavement, and especially diseases like smallpox and flu and measles. You build up immunity and antibodies to disease by being exposed to them, especially when you're children. But indigenous Americans hadn't been exposed. There was no built-up immunity, and the result was devastating. Many of the nations in the West Indies were just about wiped out. On Hispaniola, there were 300,000 people who lived on that island when Columbus first arrived. Within 50 years, almost all of them were dead. Fewer than 100 were still alive. The population of Mexico fell by 90% in just 1 century, from 20 million down to 2 million. And as for what is now the United States, the native population had an immediate drop and then continued to fall throughout the 1800s. From an estimate of 10 million people, at the census of 1900, there were only 250,000 native people left in the United States. That is a fall of 97.5%. Now, the speed with which European exploration proceeded is really remarkable. And a lot of that is due to an invention that you might not think about in terms of exploration, and that's the printing press. Now, the printing press was invented just a couple decades before Columbus's journey, and that made it possible to spread information much more quickly than you could before. So news of Columbus's journey traveled really fast, and it inspired others to try the same thing. So, like Henry VII is kind of slapping himself. Oh man, I should have funded that guy. So Henry VII of England hires an explorer to go, and he becomes the first European since the Vikings to see the coast of Canada. And fishermen from France and Spain and England started fishing along the coast of eastern Canada, taking their haul back to Europe. The Portuguese head over, they send explorers, they claim what is now Brazil in 1500. But it was really the Spanish who took the lead in exploration and conquest. Mostly they were looking for wealth, for spices and gold, but they took with them missionaries. They carried flags with crosses on them, and they demanded that the native people they encountered convert or die. The first European explorer to encounter one of the major cities, one of the major urban civilizations, was Hernán Cortés. He arrived in the city of Tenochtitlan in 1519. Tenochtitlan was the center of the Mexica Empire, people that we tend to refer to as Aztecs. And Tenochtitlan had about 200,000 residents. It had a massive temple, which you can see in this picture, had a royal palace and a central market, and one of Cortez's men said that it looked like an enchanted vision. The wealth and the power of the Mexica Empire rested on their ability to dominate their neighbors. They conquered other people, and they demanded tributes of crop and of gold, and they sacrificed prisoners of war. Now, the Spanish already viewed all native people as barbarians, and that practice of the Aztecs just reinforced that. I think we can all agree human sacrifice is bad. But we should remember that in Europe at the same time, in Spain at the same time, men and women were being burned alive as religious heretics. Criminals were executed in gory public spectacles. So the Spanish are not that different from the Aztecs. It really didn't take long for Cortez to conquer the city, and people have used that as evidence that the Europeans were obviously superior. And yes, Cortez had guns. But again, those guns were not very good, and he only had a few hundred men. Cortez won because he went to those neighbors, the people that the Aztecs had conquered and subjugated, and said, I can help you. I can help you get rid of those SOBs. If you will join with me, we will get rid of the Aztecs, and they will never take your children away. They will never take your gold. They will never demand tribute again. Plus, he was helped along by a smallpox epidemic that devastated the city and incapacitated most of the Aztec soldiers. After the conquest of Tenochtitlan, which today Mexico City is built on top of, fleets of ships carrying gold and silver from the mines of Mexico were heading back to Europe, making Spain the wealthiest nation on the continent. They also discovered urban civilizations. Oh, discovered, that's, yeah, I shouldn't say that. They came in contact with urban civilizations in South America, some of whom had really cool architecture, highly complex governments and religious systems, and really cool ways of farming. This is a picture of Machu Picchu. It's the capital of the Inca Empire, which was in South America, centered in what is today Peru, but also stretching into Chile and other parts of South America. One of the things that they did that was really useful, and this is going back to talking about the farming techniques in the Southwest and the Three Sisters, is they use this terrace style of farming. You know, it's a very mountainous region of the world. It's also a very cold region of the world, especially when you get high up on the slopes. And so they use this style of farming to take advantage of what water and soil is there, and you would plant different crops at different terrace levels. So like potatoes can grow in different circumstances and in a different environment and with different water levels than like corn will grow or cotton will grow. And the Aztecs grew all of them. The Incas grew all of these, but they would grow them at different terrace levels. So they could maximize their use of space here in the mountains. And then the Inca leader was kidnapped by the Spanish and executed publicly. We were talking about like the Hopewell and the ancestral Pueblo and their impressive monumental buildings. We see that also in South America, again near the Incas. We looked at that picture of Serpent Mound in Ohio that's so big that you can't see the whole thing from the earth. In South America, in Peru, in villages around where the Incas lived, you see these drawings, these etchings in the earth that are kind of similar. There are these effigies. They look like different animals, like spiders or monkeys or birds, but they're all so huge. Like the spider is 150 feet long. They're all so big that you can't see any of them from the ground. You can only see them from the sky. So this is an example of South American higher mathematics. By the middle of the 1500s, Spain had established an immense empire. Spain controlled, well, everything in yellow here in the Americas was something that Spain claimed or controlled. Everything in yellow here in Asia is something that Spain either controlled or claimed on the map. Everything in Europe, Spain also had control over. And they've also got some claims here in Africa. The gold here on the map is a little more extensive than what Spain could actually control, but they're certainly making encroachments into Africa in these gold areas. In the New World, Spain's empire stretched from the Andes down in South America, through Mexico, through the Caribbean, through Florida, into the southwestern states. Spain's empire was bigger than the ancient Roman Empire. Now, its center in North America was Mexico City, their magnificent capital of New Spain that was built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. Mexico City had churches and hospitals. The first university in the Americas was the University of Mexico, which still exists. Now, when other Europeans arrive, when the French and the Spanish start to colonize, they tend to be rural colonies, kind of scattered. But Spain, from the beginning, was an urban civilization. They wanted what they called an empire of towns. For centuries, Spanish-American cities like Mexico City, Lima in Peru, and Quito in Ecuador were far more impressive than most of the cities in Europe were. Now, the Spanish Empire's size wasn't the only way that it rivaled the Roman Empire. It also had a similarly complex and efficient governing system, way of governing the colonies. Now, the first Spaniards who arrived, obviously, were the conquistadors. After they swept through with the raping and the pillaging, the Spanish crown kind of freaked out and decided to replace the conquistadors with a more stable system of government. They want lawyers and bureaucrats, not swords. And for a long time, the government of Spanish America was very similar to the government of Spain itself. Spain had these kings who considered themselves absolute rulers. And an absolute ruler, at least in theory, has complete control over every aspect of the society. Like laws and authority all start at the top with the king. Now, the council can only do what is approved by the king. They would appoint colonial officials who exercise the absolute authority of the king in the New World. Now, Spanish kings didn't really like democracy. They don't want elected assemblies in Spain or in their New World Empire. So colonial officials were appointed by the king. They were not elected. And usually those officials were born in Spain itself, rather than being born in the colonies. Fresh new officials directly from Spain were supposed to keep the empire and the king's will on everybody's mind and like give you a yearly booster shot of Spanish custom and tradition. Like, if you appointed officials who were born in Mexico, if you stopped sending people directly from Spain, eventually your colonies might forget about Spain. Like, they might forget about the king. He's so far away. But by appointing Spanish-born officials, the king keeps his place at the top of the food chain and also in a constant reminder of who people serve and what power he has over them. Now, that system, the king directly appointing, lasted about as long as Spain remained a strong, relevant power in Europe, and eventually, the Spanish power will decline. By the late 1500s, their empire, their control of the seas is starting to crumble. Early 1600s, they start to lose bits of their empire. And when that happens, then Spanish subjects who are born in the colonies are able to take advantage of that. They start to take more and more control. An intermixing of people began at first contact. Mixed race, European, Spanish-European, Native, and also some African intermixing began at first contact. By 1600, mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous origin, were the largest part of the urban population in Mexico. Over time, Spanish America evolved into this hybrid culture. That's part Spanish and part Native, and in some areas part African, but with a single official religion and language and government. One example of this blending of cultures is this lady. It's the Virgin Mary, obviously, but specifically, she's the Virgin of Guadalupe. In 1531, an Indian woman reported seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary near her village of Guadalupe. But instead of being blonde and blue-eyed, like a lot of European images of Mary was, this Mary looked very much like a dark-skinned Indian woman. She had dark hair, she had brown eyes, she appeared to this woman as one of her people. And so this woman took from her vision the idea that Christianity was for Indian people as well, not just something that was imposed on them by the colonizers, but something that could be for them. The Virgin of Guadalupe would come to be revered by millions of people, Indian and Mestizo and Spanish, and has become a symbol of the modern nation of Mexico. A few Spaniards stopped to wonder what gave them the right to claim land that belonged to somebody else. They had, like all Europeans did, they had immense confidence that their culture was the best. They expected that everyone they came in contact with would want to be just like them. And when indigenous people resisted, it reinforced the Spanish assumption that anyone who didn't want to be like them was uncivilized, maybe not even capable of being civilized, maybe not even human. Europeans brought with them a long history of using violence against other nations and sometimes against their own people. But they also brought with them this missionary zeal to spread what they saw as the benefits of their own culture, and Spain is no exception to that. Spain established their overseas empire in the aftermath of their unification and their reconquista with this newly powerful royal government. Spain looks at what they have accomplished in their own country and says, I mean, obviously we're the best, right? Or we wouldn't have been able to do this. So everyone should want to be like us. Now the Pope helped Spain along, helped Spain build their empire by officially dividing the Western Hemisphere between Spain and Portugal in 1493. Portugal got everything to the east of this line, which was Brazil, and then Spain got to claim the West. The Pope totally ignored the rest of Europe. That's going to have an effect when religious wars start. One of the reasons why Spain and Portugal stayed resolutely Catholic is because the popes generally treated them pretty good, but Northern Europe felt kind of screwed in this deal. The Pope justified dividing the New World by requiring Spain and Portugal to spread Catholicism to try and convert the native population. Both Spain and Portugal were already used to forced conversions. They'd both done it against Muslims and Jews. To them, to Spain and Portugal, national glory and this religious mission went hand in hand. The rulers of Spain consistently said that their number one goal in colonization was to save native people from heathenism. They said that their goal is not to exterminate native people, not to push them off their land, but to transform them into obedient Christian subjects of the Spanish crown. Many Spanish writers insisted that native people might eventually be raised up to the level of European civilization. But to do that meant the destruction of native spiritual lives and traditions and existing societies and political structures. Now, the kings might say, the writers and the intellectuals might say, oh, we're only doing this to help native people. But to the actual colonizers, to the Spanish subjects who came here and took the land, the large native population of the Americas were not souls to be saved. They were a labor force to be organized to get the gold and the silver. And the tension between these two ideas, saving Indians and enslaving them, scarred Spanish rule in the Americas for 300 years. On the one hand, you've got these guys saying, we're bringing true freedom through conversion. Even enslaving people is justified because it will help us correct their heathen ways. On the other hand, Spanish control of the Americas, especially at first, caused a disastrous fall in the native population because of epidemics and also because of the brutal conditions that people were subject to. The conquistadors and then the governors required people to acknowledge the Catholic Church and to provide tribute in gold and silver. And they saw no conflict, no contradiction between enriching themselves and saying that they were serving God. But it didn't take too long for some people to see that conflict. In the 1530s, the Pope at the time, Pope Paul III, outlawed the enslavement of Indians. He declared Indians to be, in his words, truly men who must not be treated like animals. He did this in part because he was getting some really disturbing reports from a group of Spanish priests, particularly one priest named Bartolomé de las Casas. Bartolomé de las Casas. And these priests, particularly Las Casas, were writing to him about the devastations faced by the indigenous population and what Spain was doing to people. Las Casas' father had actually sailed with Columbus on his second voyage, and Las Casas himself had been part of the plunder of Peru. He himself had owned a plantation on Cuba, and he had owned Indian slaves. But in 1514, he up and freed all of his slaves, and he started preaching against the injustices that he saw in Spain's New World colonies. He denounced Spain in his letters to the Pope for causing the deaths of millions of innocent people. And he's not exaggerating. Now, let's look at the years here. Columbus's first journey was in 1492. Las Casas starts writing to the Pope in 1514. Y'all, it's been 22 years. It has not been a very long time here, right? And Las Casas is already accurately saying Spain has caused the deaths of millions of people. Las Casas said, "It is Spain's practice in every land they discover to stage a massacre, to make the inhabitants tremble with fear." He listed in shocking detail cruelties carried out by Spanish colonizers, including burning people alive. He said when they found a new village, people who had not yet been subjugated, they would go in and they would choose people at random and just set fire to them. The idea was those who were left alive would be too afraid to fight back. He said in some places they would separate, adults and boys and girls. They would take the girls with them. They would set dogs on the boys, and they would burn the parents alive. Las Casas insisted that native people were rational human beings, not barbarians, and that Spain, first of all, is violating the laws of God by this cruelty, and secondly, has no grounds to deprive humans of their land and their freedom. Now, Las Casas did believe that Spain had the right to rule the Americas, but he argued that Indian people should not be treated as slaves. They should be treated as the subjects of the Spanish crown, just as any Spanish-born person would be. Largely because of Las Casas' letters, the Pope issued this ruling that Indians can no longer be enslaved. And in the 1540s, Spain passed a series of laws that they called the New Laws. And the New Laws said Indians can't be enslaved. Spain's original labor system in the Americas was based on slavery. It was called the encomienda system. The encomienda system, that first labor system, had allowed Spanish settlers, the encomenderos, to have full authority over conquered Indian lands and all the people on those lands. In the 1540s, after Las Casas, after the Pope, when Spain passed the New Laws, they got rid of the encomienda system. This new system that they put in place was called the repartimiento system. Under this new system, Indians were free people. They were entitled to be paid for the work that they did. However, before you start thinking that this is a totally modern, normal system, they were required to work for Spanish colonizers. They didn't have a choice about that, but they did have to be paid for their work. They had to be allowed to keep part of the harvest, keep part of what they had mined, but they are required to work. They have to provide a fixed amount of labor every year to the settlers. And if they want to become subjects of the Spanish crown, they have to convert to Catholicism, which means they also owe labor to the priests, to the missionaries. So you have to work by law for the Spanish colonizers. And if you want to gain any kind of legal protections, you, as a Spanish subject, then you also have to work for the priests. There's going to be a lot of push and pull between the landlords and the priests over who is going to get what bit of labor. A long struggle for control of Indian labor is going to wreck a lot of these colonies. Both sides declared that they themselves were good and humane. It's the other side that's exploiting native people. By the end of the 1500s, work in the Spanish Empire consisted mostly of forced wage labor by natives, some slave labor by Africans in the island colonies and a few parts of the mainland. The Pope's order that Indians could not be enslaved said absolutely nothing about enslaving Africans. Like all empires, Spain's was very exploitative. Over time, the way that they treat native people will improve somewhat, but Las Casas' writings and the abuses that they exposed contributed to the image of Spain in the rest of the world as being like uniquely brutal and exploitative. And that will be a potent justification for Spain's European rivals to challenge Spain's dominance in the New World. Like England will say, well, we've got to establish an empire, we have to challenge Spain, and we're going to be better than them. We're not going to be as brutal as Spain was. And we're going to take a minute, we're going to kind of go off on a tangent here, about something called the Columbian Exchange, or the Great Biological Exchange. You will hear both terms used, it's the same thing. Columbian Exchange, Great Biological Exchange. What this is you've got these two groups of people meeting for the first time. Europeans and indigenous Americans meeting for the first time. And they've each got different things that the other group has never seen before. And they exchange these things. Like plants and animals and illnesses from Europe are brought to the New World and start to be used and spread here. And plants and animals and illnesses from the New World are taken by the colonizers back to Europe and spread and begin to be used there. And it just changes everything. A lot of the assumptions we have about the way the world works today is a result of this exchange. For example, in things that came from Europe, from the old world, to the New World, think of the stereotype of the Plains nations. You know, through Hollywood and media, we get this image of the Plains nations riding horses across the plains, traveling long distances to hunt bisons, wind in the hair. But they didn't have horses until the Spanish arrived. And the Plains nations traveled and they hunted, yes, but they did it on foot, which meant that they traveled shorter distances. They hunted in smaller areas. The arrival of the horse allowed them to expand where they could hunt. It gave us that stereotype. It also made them more mobile in hunting and in warfare. It expanded their trade networks. It got them access to all sorts of new things, and it brought them in contact with different nations as well. The first horses they got was a band of little mustangs that the Spanish lost, basically, and worked their way up to the plains. And a lot of the crops that we think of as traditionally American, South American or Central American crops, weren't originally here, were not native to the Americas. If we think of coffee, when I think of coffee, I think of Colombian coffee. Coffee came from Africa and the Middle East. When I think of sugarcane, I think of Haiti, I think of the Dominican Republic. But sugarcane came from Africa. The first sugar plantations here didn't start until the Portuguese started colonizing the islands in the Caribbean. Coffee, didn't arrive until Europeans arrived. If you got up at 5:30 in the morning in 1491 in what is today Oklahoma, there would be zero coffee for you to drink. I don't know how they did it. Dandelions, of all things. If you spend a lot of time caring for your yard, or you've got parents who do, you've probably heard folks cursing the maker of dandelions, those awful weeds. And when you were a kid, you may have gone around blowing the heads off dandelions, little puffs, and making a wish. But Native American kids, pre-Columbus, didn't do that because they didn't have dandelions. Europeans deliberately brought these nasty invasive weeds, not so that they could hurt 21st century people who care about their lawns. They brought dandelions as a food crop. You can eat them. You can saute the greens, you can use them in salads, you can even make dandelion wine, which is what this picture is of. And of course, dandelions are ridiculously easy to grow, right? You don't even have to try, it's like the easiest crop. Europeans also brought over infectious diseases. Native people had no resistance against these diseases. They had no resistance to any kind of airborne infectious disease. Airborne diseases are the ones that are spread through coughing or sneezing or contact with the air, like measles and the flu and smallpox. Airborne diseases didn't exist at all in the New World, and so Native people had no resistance to them. There's some evidence of a plague-like virus that struck North America a few centuries before Columbus arrived, but it seems to have gone dormant by the time of first European contact. And so a number of generations had grown up without being exposed to any airborne disease. Now, there were bloodborne diseases here. There were cancers, there were sexually transmitted infections, so it's not like the New World was totally disease-free. It's just that this type of illness is totally new. So there's no personal immunity, there's certainly no herd immunity. And smallpox was the major one. Smallpox is what absolutely devastated the native population from the Caribbean to Alaska. It was so virulent, it spread so quickly that you might not even know you were carrying it. Like you live on San Salvador, right? And you have contracted smallpox immediately from the Spanish. You don't know you're sick. So you go to the next island over to trade and you spread it to them. And then they go to the next island over to trade and it spreads. And then somebody goes to the mainland to trade and then it just takes out everybody. I mean, people who'd never even heard that Europeans existed were dying of smallpox. It was like a wildfire. Now, as far as things that originate here, that come from the Americas, and then spread to the rest of the world, plants were probably the most important. The crops of the Americas absolutely transformed the rest of the world. For example, when we think of Ireland and their food, we think of potatoes, Irish potatoes, and the Irish potato famine that led to so much immigration to the United States. Irish Americans are the second largest ancestral group in the U.S., and their first big wave of immigration came during the potato famine. But Ireland didn't have potatoes before 1492 because potatoes are native to Central and South America. What about Italian food, or Italian American food, when you think about that? The most popular kinds of pasta sauces are tomato-based sauces like marinara. But before 1492, there were no tomato-based pasta sauces, strictly an American product. If you tried going to the Olive Garden in Rome in 1491 and ordering spaghetti and meatballs with marinara, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But now, every region of Italy has at least one tomato-based sauce, and it's especially popular in southern Italy, and who can imagine spaghetti without it? There was also one major disease that we aren't certain, we think was American in origin, that spread to the rest of the world. And that illness that we think was American is syphilis. Syphilis is a really unfortunate sexually transmitted disease. that can cause deformities, can cause the loss of soft tissue. The tips of your fingers, the tip of your nose can rot off, the lobes of your ears can rot off, and then it causes massive brain damage, insanity, and death. In fact, when Columbus returned to Spain after his first voyage, several of his sailors were infected with syphilis that we think they picked up in the Caribbean islands. That will spread around the world, and it will affect, it'll affect medicine, it'll affect fashion, it'll affect wars. Several of the wars in the 16 and 1700s, the outcome hinged on which side was dying the most from syphilis. Not dying the most in battle, but dying from syphilis and not able to fight. Like France tried to invade Italy. We might not actually have a nation of Italy anymore, but the French soldiers started weakening and dying of syphilis, and so they couldn't complete that conquest. The syphilis was still a major public health fear during the First World War. They tried to take a lot of precautions to protect First World War soldiers, and that was only 100 years ago. When we look at the specifics of this, we can see how absolutely profoundly the Columbian Exchange affected the world that we live in terms of the food that we have access to, and the animals that we have, and the diseases that we catch. So another thing that Europeans brought with them when they arrived here is a very different idea of freedom than what we think of today. One of the things that we talk about when we're discussing the history of the U.S. is freedom. What does it mean now? What did it mean then? And depending on when the then was, it could mean vastly different things. That the kind of freedom that early European settlers, especially early English settlers, wanted, the kind of freedom that they understood, what they meant when they said the word freedom, was not the same as freedom understood by native people, or freedom understood by modern people of any race. Europeans tended to believe that native people were both too free and also desperately in need of being freed from their own cultures. When we talk about freedom today, we usually think of it in terms of rights, what your rights are. But in Europe at this time period, freedom was not a right. It was a privilege. And privilege, the word privilege means private law. So the freedoms that people talked about and the freedoms that people had were not inborn rights. It depended on their station in life, on their status, and on the privileges that came with that status. Remember that the time period that we're talking about, first contact is the late 1400s. A lot of Europe hasn't even started the Renaissance yet. It's still the medieval period. There is still feudalism in many parts of Europe, where if you're a good supporter of the king, he will give you not just land, but the people that live on it. If you owned land, you also owned serfs, people who were bound to that plot of land and owed you their service. In England, that wasn't outlawed until 1660. They start colonizing in 1607. So they're bringing this medieval idea with them. In France, their feudal system lasted until their revolution in the 1780s. In Russia, it lasted until early 20th century. Their ideas of freedom are not ours. We're going to focus really on England, because that's the country that colonized the 13 original colonies. England was a little different from France and a little different from Spain. The laws regarding women tended to be stricter in England than in Spain, but English feudalism, even though it was still on the books, it was still legal, was starting to decline. And England did have a little hint of what will become democracy. England had parliament. They still have parliament. It's kind of similar to Congress. Parliament has two houses, just like our Congress, but one of those houses is the House of Lords. Not just anybody can get in there. You don't get elected to the House of Lords. You get it by having a title. If you're the Duke of Ottawa County, you get a seat in the House of Lords, and then you pass it on to your son, and his son, and on down the line. And it's the House of Lords, this unelected body, that during this time period of first contact, they're the ones who advise the king. They're the ones who pass most of the laws. Unelected people have that power. But England also had a House of Commons, and the House of Commons was elected. Now, the Commons didn't have a lot of power at this time, and mostly the men who were elected to the House of Commons were very wealthy. They're men who would like to be part of the nobility someday, and they can only be elected by other wealthy men. So they don't represent a majority of the people. Most of the adult men in England could not vote. You had to own a certain amount of land, and well over half the men in England owned no land at all. But all of these different levels of society had their own privileges, their own freedoms. So at the bottom, serfs, no rights at all. When serfdom was abolished, they became peasants. Peasants had the right to earn wages, but that's pretty much it. If you lived in the cities, there would be a middle class. It would be like merchants and craftsmen, and each town, the king would issue each town what they called town privileges, which is like your town can have a market, you can have a town council. But those privileges came from the king. And if you made the king angry, he could take those privileges away. You no longer get to have a town council. And also it might be sacked and burned to the ground, in which case the right to a town council is the least of your problems. Landowning men, they're a step up. Landowning men are above even merchants and craftsmen. And they have the privilege, the freedom, to demand labor from their peasants. But they do have to allow their peasants to keep a part of the harvest. Landowning men also have the privilege, the freedom, to demand military service from the peasants beneath them. Now, noblemen who own huge parcels of land, they can demand those things from smaller landowners under them. So if you're just like a regular landowner, you've got 100 acres of land. Right? You're better off than a lot of people. You're better off than the peasants, certainly. You can demand things from them. But you also owe things to people who are above you. They can make demands of you. Now, if you're the king, you can demand just about anything you want. And the only limit to your power is the Pope until the 1500s, and then there won't be any limit on your power. And the king has the privilege, the freedom, not just to demand things from people beneath him, but to hand out much harsher punishments than somebody else can. So if you're a peasant and you annoy your landowner, the landowner who controls your labor, he can fine you in crops, or he can have you hanged. But if you commit treason against the king, you'll be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which means hanged, cut down while you're still alive, have your belly sliced open, your intestines ripped out, and then once you're dead, they'll cut your body into 4 pieces and send you on a tour of the country so everybody understands why they should not disobey the king. But there again, it depended on your social status. That's a punishment for a commoner who commits treason. If you're a nobleman who commits treason, they're not going to draw and quarter you. They'll just behead you. Women. If you were a common woman married to a common man and you commit adultery, that is a crime. You might have the tip of your nose cut off. But if you're the queen and you commit adultery against the king, he could have you burned alive. Now, he never actually did. There's no record of any English king actually having the queen burned alive. But, sometimes they were executed in cleaner ways. Henry VIII knocked off two of his wives that way. The only restraint on the king was the church. And after the Reformation, when England became a Protestant country, then there's no limit on the king at all. When you live in this kind of society, when somebody talks about wanting more freedom, they don't mean living outside the system. They mean moving up within this very restrictive system. And that made Native America look like anarchy to Europeans. Christopher Columbus, Vespucci, when they came here, at first they described the native people they met as friendly and helpful and gentle and living in good society. But those positive images were very quickly overshadowed by this much more negative idea that native people needed restraint that they didn't have. Early European descriptions of native people as barbarians centered on three areas, which we already kind of talked about: the religion and the land and the gender roles. European newcomers often assumed that native people were uncontrolled, that it was essentially just anarchy, that people could do whatever they wanted to do, and there needs to be some kind of leash. That real society has these levels. Real society, good society, has privileges depending on your status. The colonizers quickly decided that native people did not understand what freedom was, that freedom meant control. Early English dictionaries for Indian languages usually had no entry under freedom or liberty. They said that Indians don't have words for freedom or liberty. There was often no word for oppression or slave, but we kind of glossed over that. Europeans considered native people barbaric in part because they didn't seem to live under what Europeans could recognize as established governments or fixed laws. Now, native people did have governments and laws. We've talked about them. But Europeans didn't recognize those as real governments. In a sense, native people were too free for European comfort. One Italian explorer wrote back home that the native people he met lived in absolute freedom. He did not mean that as a compliment. Others said that it would be better for native people to be made slaves so that they can be taught the proper way to be free. Which in like the 21st century sounds absolutely bat guano insane, doesn't it? And this European idea of freedom as a privilege, and as one that was usually tied to land ownership, that didn't have much meaning for most native people. You know, in most Indian societies, individuals were expected to think for themselves. Collective decisions might be made, but you didn't always have to go along with those collective decisions. People tended to be judged according to their ability to live up to what was expected of them. But everybody had to live up to that standard. You know, there's no levels of standards, right, the way there was in Europe. There are no separate laws in most native societies that only applied to poor people. There were no laws that only applied to noble classes, because aside from the Natchez, most tribes didn't have noble classes. The well-being of the nation and everyone in it was supposed to be standardized. Now, in Europe, we've got some very old ideas of freedom, but we're also starting to get some newer ideas of freedom. But one of the old ideas of freedom that Europe, and especially England, is bringing over to the New World is this idea called Christian freedom. Christian freedom. This does not mean freedom of religion. So when you come into the exam, if you choose the answer that says Christian freedom means that you get to choose what kind of religion you're going to follow, that is wrong. Christian freedom, Christian liberty, had nothing at all to do with religious freedom, religious tolerance, which was unheard of in most of Europe at this time. Every nation in Europe had an officially established church. Every nation told you what forms of worship was acceptable and what weren't. And dissenters weren't just persecuted by the church, they could be killed by the civil government for worshiping incorrectly. What Christian freedom meant was being free of sin. It's something that was very appealing to a stratified society. If you're a serf, or even once that's done away with, if you're a peasant in England, there's really not much that you can expect out of life. There's not much freedom that you're gonna get. So this idea of Christian liberty says that if you work toward being free of sin, then you can become free in the afterlife. You don't have these freedoms here in this life, but this life doesn't matter that much, right? It's the afterlife that matters. So if you are a good person, you know your place, you obey your master, then you can become free of sin in the afterlife. And that idea is going to be brought to the Americas when the English start colonizing. That concept of freedom is really based on a terror of anarchy. It's based on a real fear that people will start to ignore the different statuses, that they will start to ignore the hierarchy. And so you tell people that this is the only real kind of freedom, being free of sin in the afterlife, and the only way you can achieve that is by knowing your place, doing your duty, obeying your master. And even in secular ideas of freedom, there is this insistence on obedience as well. Freedom is not people choosing for themselves. Freedom is obedience to the law and to your master. But even the rule of law didn't apply to all people equally. Inequality was built into the fabric of life. Within English families, men exercised authority over their wives and children. We talked about that legal doctrine of coverture. When a woman married, she surrendered her legal identity. She became covered by that of her husband. She can't own property, even if it was hers first, even if it was hers before they married. She can't sign contracts. She can't control her own wages if she worked outside the home. She could not write her own will. In only the rarest of circumstances could she get a divorce. Now, women did have some legal protections. If her husband died before she did, she could claim a third of his property and live on that for the rest of his life. But when she died, that property is not hers. It will pass to his male heirs. This is freedom. This is what they understand as liberty. It comes from knowing your place and fulfilling your duties. A well-ordered family depended on obedience, and a well-ordered society depended on obedience. Freedom was a function of your social class. Each level of society had its own privileges, its own freedoms. And so in that sense, English freedom was still very medieval. Most of our modern ideas of freedom didn't exist. There is no religious freedom. The law told you what form of religion was acceptable. There's no freedom of the press. The government would censor publications it didn't like. There's no freedom of speech. Criticizing the government could get you killed, unless you were a member of the House of Commons. If you were elected to the House of Commons and you were giving a speech in Parliament to the House of Commons, then you can say whatever you want during that speech. Once you walk out the doors, though, you can't say it. You can only say it in that speech. Now, even though people of wealth enjoyed many more privileges, many more freedoms than everybody else did, there were certain rights of Englishmen which applied to all freeborn men in England. This is a question that is absolutely going to be on the exam, understanding these ideas of freedom. The rights of Englishmen are an old, originally medieval idea of English freedom. The rights of Englishmen come from the Magna Carta, which was signed by King John after a very lengthy dispute with some of his noblemen. And the Magna Carta lists a series of liberties, the rights of Englishmen, which are granted by the king to all the free men of our realm. Now, a couple of issues with this. They're granted by the king. These are not natural rights. England didn't have any concept of natural rights at this time, not the way we do today. These are rights that are given to you by the king, which means if the king gets honked off at you, he could take them away. So that's one problem. The other problem was, at the time the Magna Carta was signed in the 13th century, England didn't have a lot of free men. More than half of the men in England were serfs. So it didn't apply to all that many people. This is still, firmly in the days of feudalism. But over time, as the feudal system in England started to die off, the Magna Carta came to apply to more and more men. If you're a serf, you're not born free. But if you're a peasant, after feudalism is done away with, then you are born free. You have nothing. But since you're freeborn, you have the rights of Englishmen, granted through the king by the Magna Carta. And so these rights listed in the Magna Carta, the rights of Englishmen, came to be seen as the basis of English freedom. And the laws laid down, the rules laid down in the Magna Carta, applied to the king as well. There came to be this idea that even the king ought to be subject to the rule of law, and that all men, all freeborn men, regardless of status, have certain freedoms, like trial by jury, the right to face your accuser, the right not to be fined for crimes you have not been convicted of, the right against cruel and unusual punishment. At the beginning of the 1600s, we're shooting forward in time a little bit, England starts establishing its New World colonies, late 1500s, early 1600s. And when they're doing this, ideas of freedom only played a minor role in England's political debates. But at the same time that England is establishing their colonies, they also start going through this series of political upheavals that made the concept of English freedom and what it included and who it applied to much more important. One of those upheavals was caused by Parliament becoming more powerful, particularly the House of Commons, the elected part of Parliament. As Parliament became more powerful, they insisted more and more that, first of all, the king must follow the law, and second, that the elected House of Parliament ought to have a larger say in what that law was. Now, the kings at this time, the kings when England is starting to establish its colonies, this would be James I and Charles I, they did not look favorably on these ideas, on the idea that they would have to follow the law. So a civil war broke out between Parliament and king. There was also a religious element to this war. Parliament was led by Protestants, and the king, at the time the war started, Charles I, he was sympathetic toward Catholics. And in 1649, the army of Parliament caught up with the king, and they beheaded him. That's actually not unusual. In the olden days, England killed at least one king every century. But before this, they'd always had another guy waiting in the wings. It was the king is dead, long live the king. This time, though, they don't have another guy. They abolished the monarchy. England was declared a commonwealth and a free state, a nation allegedly governed by the will of its people. What does that do to the rights of Englishmen? What does that do to all of these privileges and all of these different legal statuses that were supposed to come from the king? I mean, the Magna Carta said that the rights of Englishmen are granted by the king. But the king is dead, and there is no new king. We have abolished kingship. Do you still have the rights of Englishmen? Does trial by jury still apply? If that was a right granted by the king, and there's no king to grant it. I mean, obviously you still want trial by jury. You still want to have a town council and a market day. You still want the right to face your accuser. You still want all of that. But you can no longer claim them from the king. So now you have to start looking around and saying, maybe our rights come from something else. Maybe the rights of Englishmen aren't granted by the king. Maybe they're just like inborn rights. Maybe they're like natural rights, kind of unalienable. I'm not sure if we're comfortable using that word just yet, but we're thinking about it at least. Now, this period where England didn't have a king lasted for 11 years. Eventually, the monarchy will be restored. But by that point, the breakdown of authority and this question over where your rights come from created intense conflicts over liberty and authority and what it really meant to be a freeborn Englishman. And just like in every civil war and every revolution, the idea of freedom took on new meanings in this 11-year kingless period. And so we get these new ideas of freedom. The rights of Englishmen, old, medieval. Now we get these new ideas of freedom. We see ideas of religious toleration, at least for Protestants, start springing up. We see this group called the Levelers, who become England's first really democratic political movement. In the middle of the 1600s, the Levelers demand a written constitution with, all your rights and privileges laid out. They demanded an expanded right to vote. All adult men should be able to vote, they said. They wanted to get rid of the House of Lords in Parliament. They said unelected people have no business making the laws. Some of them condemned slavery. And the Levelers believed that freedom was a universal entitlement. You're born free, and you have certain rights. This is the first group in England to really say this. Another group, kind of an offshoot of the Levelers, more radical than them, were called the Diggers. The Diggers went even further. They also believed that freedom should be applied equally, at least for men. But they also wanted to end the idea of private property. They believed that private property should be abolished, that all of the land in England should be held in common. It should be owned by all of the people together, and that will end poverty. Now, these are very small groups. The Levelers are pretty small. The Diggers are even smaller. They never have many followers, and the people in power absolutely hate them. But these radical groups will have an impact on ideas of freedom in England's American colonies. So one of the ways of getting rid of political radicals in the old days was to pack them up and ship them off to the New World. So British North America gets way more than our fair share of people like the Levelers and the Diggers and their ideas of universal rights, of natural rights, and freedom and the right to vote, and abolition. And they are going to create a very different political atmosphere here than Britain has. And eventually, not in the 1600s, but a century later, these ideas are going to form a wedge between the government of the British Empire and its colonies over here in the Americas. Okay, so that is the end of Lecture 1. And next time we're going to talk about how the English actually get over here to start their colonies, how they govern their colonies, and what happens to the people around them when they start establishing these colonies.